glad to be joined today by Aaron Bastani, co-founder of Novara Media, which is, I guess, a new media entity. How would you describe it in a nutshell?
A progressive multimedia platform. I mean, we don't really like to use the word progressive in the UK, but
Yeah.
progressive multimedia platform. We do podcasts, we do video content, we do text content. Our podcast is broadcast on a London-based radio station called Resonance FM. So a bit like you guys back in the day,
Yeah. I'm actually not crazy about the term progressive either. I don't make much of a stink about it, but to me, like, it's funny. I think of an old kind of Marxist that I once spoke to about progressivism, who would refer to it as progressive, like PWO, like they're trying to mock it as if a
right?
baby would use it, because it's, I don't know, it can mean almost anything and has different meanings over the course of history, and it's just not necessarily how I would self-identify, but others do in the institution of
Yeah,
TYT. So I mean, that's fine with me. But anyway, nomenclatural point aside, there was an interesting election last week in the UK,
yeah,
and Jeremy Corbyn prevailed. One thing that I've been talking about with a variety of people, and I'm curious to get your perspective on it, is at opendemocracy.net, Anthony Barnett, who I actually also spoke to about this, wrote a pretty interesting piece on June 5th in which he speculated or theorized that actually Jeremy Corbyn, contrary to popular assumptions, was able to seize on the anti-establishment sentiment that Brexit unleashed. Now, most people had assumed that energy was all going to be on the reactionary side of the spectrum, but it seems as though the vacuum of power that Brexit occasioned actually created an opening for Corbyn to sort of seize on that spirit. I mean, is that something that
no,
you've observed?
no. It's
Okay.
bigger than that. It's bigger than that. It's a response to the 2008 crisis. We've got, in this country, 65 million people in Britain. 17 million people of working age have less than £100 in their bank accounts, $120. Okay, pay's gone down by 10% in the last 9 years. Real median take-home pay. Home ownership is at its lowest levels since 1985. So it's about a crisis of our economic model. Yes, to some extent he instrumentalised Brexit, but I think had we remained in the EU, had David Cameron still been the Prime Minister, we would have had a very different kind of general election. A classic sort of class war, because obviously you've got a juxtaposition between a radical social democrat and an Eton-educated Prime Minister. And I still think Corbyn would have done very, very well. It's much bigger than just Brexit. Brexit is a symptom of the same problem, which is a crisis of the British nation state and its economic model. They're both symptoms, but Corbyn is far bigger than just Brexit.
No, yeah, I would agree that Brexit wouldn't be anything close like the sole explanation here, but the fact that he was able to instrumentalize it to any extent, to an extent that redounded to his political advantage, is something that not a lot of people, I think, would have supposed a year ago.
Yeah, I mean, there was a good reframe. So the whole thing was, it's not hard versus soft Brexit. It's a Brexit that works for the many versus a Brexit that works for the few, which was fantastic. And most people, when they voted for Britain to leave the EU, had vague social democratic ideas in mind. So the sort of iconic bit of propaganda from the campaign last summer was this bus that said an extra £350 million every week for the NHS. And many UKIP supporting sort of Eurosceptics were seduced by that. So clearly there was a dormant social democratic frame within that, which he certainly managed to make the most of. But, at the end of the day, the majority of UKIP voters, so in 2015, the last general election, 4 million people voted for UKIP, which, because we have an electoral system like you guys, is very difficult for an insurgent new party to get that many votes. They did remarkably well. And the majority of them still went to the Tories, right? About 65% of them went to the Tories. So, yeah, he managed to... Labour weren't destroyed by Brexit, which is what a lot of the Liberal sort of commentariat was saying. He obviously did that and more. But what's buttressed... So, the Labour vote has gone from 9.3 million to 12.8. That's come from the young. That's come from the young, that's come from low-income earners who are voting for the first time. That's coming from Labour voters who were turned off after the Iraq War. So, yeah. And also the percentage of the vote that was won in England, this is a remarkable statistic. Labour just won 42% of the vote in England, which is the same as in 1997 under Tony Blair. Within the context of the hostile mainstream media we have in this country and a coup within his own party just a year ago, I mean, I think it's without doubt the greatest accomplishment in the history of British politics. Within that context, it's just remarkable.
Yeah. I don't think we have final data yet as to where the UKIP vote splintered off to, but there is some evidence, and you've seen this reported among, I've seen, anonymous Tory MPs who've lost, quoted in bewilderment, saying that we didn't expect that Labour would benefit from the collapse of the UKIP vote to the extent that they did. They probably didn't get the majority of the vote in most constituencies, but they got enough to create a critical mass. So, for example, here's one constituency that I thought was really interesting: Plymouth, Sutton, and Devonport in the southwest.
Yeah.
So, from 2015 to 2017, the UKIP vote collapsed by 11.5%, and the Labour vote increased by 16.7%, while the Conservative vote increased by only 2.1%. So it stands to reason that, Corbyn and Labour probably benefited from a confluence of factors, but one of the factors, at least in certain constituencies, was certain segments of the UKIP vote at least being inclined to go to Labour. Maybe these were formerly Labour voters who were disillusioned for whatever reason and going back. Maybe there's a new influx of Labour voters. Hard to say, but sort of.
There's some seats. Like Labour lost Mansfield to the Tories. There are some seats which are kind of inexplicable, but it seems to be at the moment. I think so. The turnout at the moment. Sorry, we've been drinking all weekend, so in terms of analysis, I'm a step behind you, I'm sure, but from what it seems, national turnout was 68%, and turnout amongst 18 to 24s was, it seems, 72%. If that's correct, I don't know any general election where the youth turnout's been higher than the actual overall figure.
And let's just pause for a second and reflect on how astonishing a figure. Let's just assume that's correct, that among 18 to 24s, the turnout was 72%. Is that right?
Yeah.
That is so unfathomable in the United States that it's hard to even fully express. It's you don't even get that high of turnout. The most active voters are basically people from age 65 to 75 or something along those lines, and even among that demographic, you don't get anything close to 72% in most areas. So for the least active constituency in terms of demographics to come out at that level really is incredible, and I think warrants a lot of interrogation as to how that was achieved, because it's a really remarkable feat.
Do you know what? I think Bernie would have done it.
Yeah.
Maybe not 72%, but I think youth turnout would have been higher than the national turnout, I think, with a Bernie Democratic candidacy last year.
Yeah, in part because Bernie had such a following on social media, and people got their news about Bernie through alternate modes of media consumption. And they bypassed traditional media, so that and it's interesting. So a year ago, Bernie's ascendance on social media was sort of dismissed as inconsequential in terms of electoral viability. But I think Corbyn demonstrates, and even Trump to some extent demonstrated, that having a foothold in the social media arena is increasingly becoming almost a necessary ingredient to assemble a winning coalition.
Absolutely. So there's Momentum, which is I'm trying to think of an equivalent in the United States, maybe like Dean for America, right? Which became Democracy for America. So, and this is terrible. This is actually Momentum is a lot better, but I'm trying to think of an equivalent.
Yeah, so, the Democracy for America isn't really a quite. I know what you're getting at, but Democracy for America is not a good analog because that was founded after Dean lost.
Yeah.
Whereas this is sort of an organization, like a loosely affiliated organization meant to support the the head of a party. So it's different. So the first Corbyn campaign, he wins. Right.
And then people say, well, we've got these Facebook assets, the social media assets, we've got this, this team, we've got this building. What do we do? So then the sedimentary kind of networks from that become Momentum. And Momentum does a lot of things, does a lot of offline, online stuff in a very integrated, intelligent way. But the Facebook stuff's been outstanding over the last 6 weeks. And an amazing statistic is that 30% around, well, between 25 and 30, it could be as high as 30%. 30% of all UK Facebook users in the last 6 weeks have seen Momentum content in their timelines. And do you want me to tell you the Momentum budget for Facebook advertising?
Please do.
£2,000.
Okay,
So it was
that's
all,
nothing.
yeah, it was all viral marketing kind of stuff, right? It was all organic. £2,000 because there's very strict spending limits in this country. So I mean that's just incredible. And in a seat which Labour was never expected to win, Canterbury, it's been Conservative since forever.
So, had been Tory since 1918, World War One.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the Labour Party. The Labour Party is an electoral force. Effectively, that's the first general election. It's an electoral force. I think after the fourth Reform Act, where basically the working class get the vote. So it's never been Labour. It's never been anything but Tory. And I think 70% of 18 to 24s in Canterbury saw Momentum content in their timelines during the course of that election. So, and that's not with targeted advertising spend. It was organic. So, I mean, just remarkable. They did an amazing thing. And yes, social media was huge because it may be difficult to convey this to an American audience. The British print media is disgusting. You know, the penultimate day of campaigning, the Sun newspaper, the second most read newspaper in the country, called Jeremy Corbyn Jihadi Jez. And this is in the context of 3 terrorist attacks in 3 months. So to do what he did in that context is remarkable. And yes, it was really contingent on social media.
Yeah. Yeah, one sort of irony of this election is that the Tories seem to have been saved by a surge in Scotland, which is not the most fertile territory for the Conservative Party historically. But that came about, I think, in part because you see the rise of the SNP, which was most manifest in 2015, when they almost swept the entire country. Mm-hmm. It's created a conundrum where the SNP is its base of voters is a little complicated to describe ideologically, but they do have a progressive component, and they're driving the force behind the independence referendum in 2014. But they've sort of caused a splitting between the left-oriented votes in Scotland, such that the Conservatives could squeak through with a plurality in some seats.
Yeah.
So how do you interpret what happened in Scotland? Do you think there's a way to kind of resolve that paradox going forward, so that Labour can maybe regain a stronger foothold without necessarily maligning what the SNP represents, which I think is legitimate in the eyes of a lot of Scots?
So I think in 2015 there's 59 seats in Scotland. Labour lost 40 of them. The SNP picked up 56 out of 59 seats. So there was 1 Liberal Democrat seat, 1 Tory seat, 1 Labour seat. And they've just lost, as of Thursday evening, Friday morning, 40% of those seats. Now, how does Labour respond to that? It's a very interesting question because, firstly, it doesn't really matter if the SNP have seats, because if you're going to have a coalition, they will never govern with the Tories. They will only ever govern with Labour. So on the one hand, SNP seats isn't as big a problem for Labour in Scotland as Tory seats are, right? That's a genuine problem. But on the other hand, the British electorate's very reticent to actually have coalitions. So if there's any kind of formal deal between the SNP and Labour ahead of an election, it goes down very, very badly. That's actually really what did Fred Miliband in 2015 in the first place.
Right. Cameron explicitly attacked him on that front in the 2015 campaign, saying, you're going to partner with a party that wants to break up the United Kingdom, and that sort of was supposed to turn off English voters.
Yeah. But I think in the longer term now, because the SNP have had look, fundamentally, they still have won over 50% of the seats in Scotland. It's still a remarkable achievement, but they weren't expecting this. Alex Salmond, their leader for so many years, their former leader, lost his seat. Their leader in Westminster, Angus Robertson, lost his seat. It was a terrible night for them. But I think the long-term strategy that now has to take place between Labour and the SNP is you being so rigid on a second independence referendum has cost you these seats. It's not going down well with the Scottish electorate generally. We can do a deal on devolution max, as it's called, effectively a federal settlement. We'll give you X, Y, Z competences. And look, if the Scottish electorate think you've done a good job after 15, 20 years, let's do it again. Fine. But you're going to have to win that trust through a federalised government. And I think the SNP will probably take that. But what's interesting for me is that the Scottish left, who were the driving force behind the independence referendum, which was shockingly close, 55-45. The grassroots street activism was driven by the Scottish left. So the only two cities which voted independence were Glasgow and Dundee, the biggest working class cities. And it was the poorest 20% who actually turned up in surprisingly high numbers. And that was driven by the left in Scotland. For me, I want those people to now join Labour, that Scottish left. I don't want them to be in the SNP. And they should be in Labour on that assumption that we'll have a federal settlement. And, if Scotland is to be independent, it's not going to be for the next 15, 20 years. And that's in their interest as well, because they won't win a referendum until they've won the trust of the Scottish people, which they can't have until they've actually governed the place for a long time.
And during the 2014 campaign, it's worth recalling that the SNP, who are the drivers of that referendum, promised that this would be a once-in-a-generation event. And it consumed the Scottish public consciousness for a long time.
Yeah.
And so therefore, for them to float this idea of pursuing a second one so soon after, I think reasonably enough caused people to kind of balk.
Yeah.
So,
but people are struggling, same problems in England as in Scotland: child poverty, housing, in-work poverty. 60% of people in this country who are categorised as being in poverty, 60% of them are working. And that's a problem in Scotland as much as England. And if you look at a party which seems obsessed with constitutional issues, rather than actually your material needs, why the hell should you vote for them? So I can understand why the Scottish electorate gave them a bloody nose on Thursday, Friday.
Yeah. Another point on this idea that Corbyn was able to instrumentalize Brexit, or at least reframe the meaning of Brexit. There are a number of ways that a Labour Party leader could have approached a general election a year after Brexit. They could have said that we are pursuing a tack where we're basically going to redo the Brexit referendum. They could have done what the SNP attempted to do, essentially. They could have said, the British public was sold a false bill of goods. They were promised these things about NHS funding. The Remain campaign was extremely poorly run because you had a Tory prime minister as its most visible public face. So therefore, we had to just kind of do this over again. And actually, some in Labour favored that approach. And the Liberal Democrats this election ran a campaign basically arguing for just for that they wanted to redo the Brexit referendum. But Corbyn didn't. Corbyn first of all acceded to the invocation of Article 50, which set into motion the binding legal process whereby Britain would extricate itself from the European Union.
Yeah,
and he's accepted Brexit as the democratically chosen outcome, and therefore wants to just kind of incorporate it into a broader vision of democratic socialism, or whatever you might term it. So that's a different path than maybe some of the more Blairite elements of the Labour Party wanted to pursue, which is basically saying we need to just kind of void the election and not honor the results. And I think that would have, if somebody of that disposition in the Labour Party were leading the party in this election, maybe that would have engendered a more of a backlash than Corbyn engendered, because he was seen as at least honoring the outcome.
I think they would have got 25% if they'd done that. I mean, that was the platform. There was a leadership race last summer, and Owen Smith, his rival, said we would do this. And the entire Liberal commentariat, everybody at The Guardian, many people within the Labour, a couple of dozen MPs, was saying we have to have a second referendum. And this would have been the worst decision in the history of the Labour Party. It would have killed the Labour Party fundamentally, because it would have meant that we would have, first of all, we wouldn't have just kept UKIP alive. We would have actually nourished them. And by having the position we did, we killed them in a by-election really in Stoke several months ago. They're finished now. But that didn't have to be the case. If the establishment was seen as split on this issue, with one party saying we will leave the EU, one saying we won't, UKIP still would have remained an insurgent force in British politics. That is not the case. So it was a fantastic decision. It wasn't easy. I mean, I remember speaking to an advisor, John McDonnell, at the beginning of the year in January, and the foresight from these guys is incredible. And he just said, look, if we can see away the next 3 months, we'll be competitive. And they did, and that's what happened. But it takes remarkable resilience to have that, backbone, when you've got the entire Liberal commentariat saying you're idiots, you've let us down, you're making the wrong decision. And lo and behold, actually, it turns out that Labour get their highest number of votes since 1997 while doing it. So it was a superb decision. But also, in addition, leaving the EU means that Britain can now bring the Royal Mail into public ownership. It means that we can increase or decrease. We should decrease it because it's a tax that hits the poor, value-added tax, VAT. So there are a number of things we can now do that, as a country that's left the EU, we can negotiate our own trade policy with the rest of the world. The EU, the European Commission, decides EU member states' trade policy at the level of the WTO. So, it was one of the best political calculations I've ever seen made by a British politician.
Yeah. John McDonnell, for people who might not be aware, is the Shadow Chancellor for the Exchequer, and seen as one of the main tacticians who is behind Corbyn, has been one of his associates for many years.
Yeah, a self-proclaimed Marxist, I might add.
Right, and it's interesting that in a different context, him being a self-proclaimed Marxist would have been a huge political liability, you would think, or maybe in a different era. But that attack doesn't seem to register as much anymore. I'm actually curious. I remember last year seeing a video from you in which you suggested that Brexit might be something worth supporting for the left, and I think you revised that later. And you just outlined a bunch of policy initiatives that might now be available to pursue because of Brexit, like nationalizing the Royal Mail and different things along those lines. I mean, do you now see there was a minority on the left who did make a case for Brexit in the UK. They didn't get a whole lot of media attention, but they did exist. Do you think any of the aspects of their argument have been validated in light of this victory by Labour, or do you think that you would have approached that the same way a year ago?
Too soon to say. Too soon to say. But I mean, people that it was called Legxit, the sort of left Brexit, the people that had that position will feel vindicated. That's what they will say. What it did do is, at least for now, it's completely drawn a line under migration as an issue. Immigration had been one of the most salient issues in the political conversation in this country for 20 years. And overnight, it's disappeared because EU membership was a proxy for the immigration debate. And Corbyn had to move right in immigration a bit, but he still had, historically speaking, the most progressive set of policies and rhetoric on immigration seen from a party leader for 40 years. So whatever. So yeah, there's an argument to be made for that, most certainly. Although it's not over yet. It's not done. And leaving the EU will undoubtedly diminish the living standards of the average Brit. So it's a tough argument to make, but they'll feel vindicated, most certainly.
Yeah. You mentioned the Guardian, and I wanted to touch on that from a media criticism perspective, because Corbyn was treated extraordinarily hostily by even media organs in the UK that are perceived as on the left, ranging from the New Statesman to the Guardian, as you mentioned. He was accused. If you go back and kind of look through some of the columns that were published starting in 2015 and throughout the two leadership elections, Corbyn was accused of everything from enabling anti-Semitism to benefiting from sexism and fostering a climate where there was excess online abuse directed toward people in the Labour Party who were his critics. And so that there was really an onslaught of that for a very long time. And then it seemed as though once the snap election was called, there was something of a shift where the Guardian took a more favorable view of him. For instance, it kind of praised his campaigning abilities, praised his poise, let's say. What do you make of that shift? Is that just kind of an expected election time polarization effect type thing, where the Labour-oriented press is going to rally behind the Labour leader no matter what, or was there something more fundamental at play there? Well,
no, because in 2010 the Guardian backed the Liberal Democrats. In 2015 they did, they backed Ed Miliband, but it was clear that it was no longer a partisan paper in that sense. So it wasn't a given that they would back Corbyn, especially given, as you've already highlighted, the position on EU membership, a second referendum. That said, there were differences which were quite clear amongst the senior staff at The Guardian. So, for instance, Jonathan Friedland, who is the editor of the comments section, was hostile to Jeremy Corbyn until 2 or 3 weeks ago, actually. Nick Cohen, a writer there, wrote a ridiculous piece of invective 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. Kath Finer, who's the editor, apparently responded to the manifesto saying, oh, it's excellent, isn't it? Of course, the minute she said that, then all the quislings that surround her were nodding their head, going, yes, Kath, it's fantastic. And now after the manifesto, yes, there was clearly a sea change. The manifesto in particular, I think, there was a sea change in their coverage. But broadly speaking, amongst the comment writers, the older writers, and of course they were forged by an experience of the mid-early 1980s with the SDP leaving the Labour Party, forming a new party, which then became the senior partner really in the Liberal Democrats. They were forged by that experience, and they believed that the left can never lead the centre left. It's always the centre left that leads the radical left. But the idea that the energy and the activists and the ability will be amongst the radical left is just anathema to them. And actually, that's a moment we're in Britain right now, where the radical left is leading the centre left. And the Labour Party is a coalition of both. The radical left is the dominant one. And they were struggling to get their heads around that. And they still are. And in their sort of mental map of the world, it's impossible that the radical left can lead the Labour Party to success. That's obviously been completely decimated. So let's see how they respond. But quite frankly, I mean, it's just been abject, their coverage. I mean, I don't need to go into details. I mean, it's been going on for 2 years now, so it's remarkable because it's sad. It's made them, an increasingly irrelevant voice on the British left at a time when it couldn't be more necessary.
Yeah, there was a tweet that I thought was pretty apt from Mike Bird, who is a writer for the Wall Street Journal, actually in London, but he made the point by saying, quote, blown away by pundit capacity to get absolutely everything wrong and then switch to confidently asserting new theories immediately after. And that's something that we saw on display very, very vividly and potently in the United States with respect to Trump and even to Sanders and to Clinton. I mean, to the whole 2016 election in aggregate, there was this very, very conspicuous lack of accountability on the part of the press for basically failing in every aspect of their jobs. And the thing with elite punditry is that when you commit an egregious failure, by and large, you incur no penalties, and actually often you accrue additional prestige and influence. So the incentives are totally perverted. And we see many of the very same people who got it so disastrously wrong in 2016, opining away now as if nothing happened, because there's no really mechanism to enforce any kind of accountability. And to me, the UK media landscape is sort of different in some nuanced respects, but I think the general principle applies, where the people who said that Labour was bound for electoral catastrophe under Corbyn look at this hostility toward Jews. That's the line Jonathan Friedland actually was promoting pretty vigorously for a long time. All these kinds of attacks that really had no bearing on reality, those people aren't going to pay any kind of reputational consequence, I would assume. So it's...
Well, hopefully. I mean, the Guardian needs to make money. It's losing money. So, and the Labour Party has 600,000 members. It's moving, actually, well, no, it's more than that now. It's well in excess of 700,000. This weekend, they're saying it's 800,000. So we could be at a moment, I think we will be almost certainly before the end of the year, Labour has 1 million members. And if you're the Guardian, forget the politics even, right? As a business decision, you need to cover this properly. And you need to have a range. I'm not just saying you have people that shill for Corbyn. You need a range of voices, some of which will reflect his politics. At the moment, they don't really have that. They have one or two. They have Owen Jones, for instance. But even Owen has been very critical of Corbyn. Primarily, I think, because he was stuck with all these idiots telling him the opposite. They were telling him he was mad. So, I'm not surprised he kind of, prevaricated in some moments. But yeah, from a business point of view, it makes zero sense to me. And the analog to the US is very, very important, especially in regards to liberal media, because like you say, there are no penalties and they just carry on. And even this weekend, I've seen people say, oh, well, the polls were wrong. What can you do? YouGov polled it correctly. YouGov had, and at the time I said this, they were doing a constituency by constituency polling, right? And it was all correct. right? And I said at the time, look, YouGov is the most robust model. It's predictive modeling. They have 50,000 informants a week. Surely it's the most reliable data out there. But the pundits, they were just picking the polls that had the worst Labour performance and as a confirmation bias. And I was saying to them, look, this has 50,000 informants a week. This is more reliable, but they have no idea what data collection or analysis is because, they're not social scientists. They're just people who are very opinionated. And actually, I think a big part of the project now in Britain in terms of changing our media is that we have people who talk about these things in a qualified manner. That's not to say that political social scientists have all the answers, but at least they, can try and avoid confirmation bias, try and avoid bandwagoning bias. I don't know. I find it remarkable. There was one guy, he said, Dan Hodges, and he said, Survation, which was another polling company, they would be an outlier if it wasn't for YouGov. And you say, well, that's the point. There's two. So it isn't an outlier, you moron. I don't know where these people come from. His mother was an MP, so that's where he came from. But yeah.
Yeah, so YouGov polled the U.S. election as well, and there was one finding that I can recall calling attention to myself because it contradicted a line of propaganda that was coming out of the Democratic media in particular. And what the Democratic media was trying to do in 2016 was downplay the fissures in the party. So they were trying to say that all these Bernie Sanders supporters, these first-time Democratic Party voters who had their consciousnesses raised by the Sanders campaign, they're all going to dutifully fall in line behind the Hillary Clinton campaign because how could they ever do anything that could even be perceived as tacitly or even directly supporting Trump? They would never be that naive. So there was a concerted effort on the part of the Clinton-supporting liberal left media in the U.S. to basically dismiss this phenomenon of fissures in the party that arose from the 2016 primaries as anything that needed to be catered to or to be taken seriously. But what YouGov found in its polling, and I think it might have been the only polling firm to actually survey for this, was that months after the Democratic convention in August, or I guess it was July of last year, which in the Democratic convention is supposed to be the big time where unity is finally obtained for the disparate factions of the party. Months and months after the Democratic convention, YouGov was finding that as many as 50% of Bernie Sanders supporters were refusing to support Hillary Clinton. Mm. And, that's not, in the grand scheme of electoral politics in the United States, which is obviously a huge country, that's not a massive percentage of the votes, but in a closely contested election, it could actually make a significant difference. And, of course, as we all know, Trump won because he won by very narrow margins in a few states. Mm. But that phenomenon was downplayed or even ignored and dismissed by people who had, confirmation bias and certain agendas that they wanted to push because it didn't comport with their pre-existing beliefs about how the election was unfolding. And I think that's just a problem across the board. In the case of the UK, I mean, the example there that's relevant would be people just assuming that Corbyn could never lead the Labour Party to anything resembling victory or to an increase in seats, which he got for the first time since 1997. And I think, it's something that needs to be reckoned with.
I mean, there were a few interesting trends for me. So it was clear in Scotland in 2014, very high turnout, really high turnout. And in the Brexit referendum last year, very high turnout. It was the biggest democratic exercise in the history of Britain. That's why we can't have another referendum. You can't say it's obsolete when more people voted in that referendum than any general election ever, right? So it was clear to me that when there are high stakes right now, people in Britain will vote. There will be high turnout. So I always said if Labour go on a radical manifesto, there'll be high turnout, not just for them, but for the people that disagree with it too. And that's what we had. We had a very high turnout general election. Theresa May is now walking dead prime minister, but she got more votes than David Cameron ever got. She got more votes than Tony Blair got in 2 elections, maybe even in 1997. She got a phenomenally high number of votes, but the point, it was a high turnout election. So there was that trend for me. There was the trend I saw with Obama in 2008 and 2012, that coalition of ethnic minorities, women and the young. And I've been saying for 2 years, Jeremy Corbyn can he can get the exact same coalition together with a far more radical set of politics and policies, but I think I can see the embryo of something very similar. And I've said that for 2 years and I was being laughed at. And I said, well, look, if you're trying to be a comparativist, an empiricist, this is a perfectly feasible set of outcomes. But, people being paid lots and lots of money not say anything particularly interesting at all would disagree. But for me, all of this, I mean, I tweeted, somebody retweeted it and I retweeted it myself. It was a tweet from 2015. And I said Labour will get 11 million votes in 2020, the next general election, but it didn't happen. It happened in 2017. But because of Scotland, they won't be able to form a government. And that's what happened. And that's not because I'm some Houdini. It was just a basic inference, you know? And you could have made a set of inferences and you could probably model 3 or 4 feasible outcomes. But this was absolutely one of them. But because these people were so blind to it, they would never, they were just unwilling to even countenance it.
Yeah, you mentioned Owen Jones a minute ago, and I follow his commentary, and he's definitely been somebody who's been relied on by the commentary as sort of an interpreter of the Corbyn phenomenon. He's, I think, knows people in his circle. He's definitely a well-known, highly regarded voice. But then in March of this year, he actually called for Corbyn to stand down.
Yeah.
So this was a time when the polling looked cataclysmic for Corbyn. At least, that was the consensus as to what the polling reflected. And and Owen Jones' point was essentially that unless Corbyn stepped aside, Labour was bound for electoral catastrophe. And it's sort of interesting to go back and kind of consider how somebody like Jones, who is a left-wing campaigner essentially, and he's also a journalist, how even he could have been susceptible to the climate that had been fostered around this idea that Corbyn was a dead end. How and you touched on this before, but how is it that somebody of his stature even could have faltered analytically in that way?
Well, first of all, I think Owen has been superb in this general election. And I think he made a terrible mistake then, but I think he's more than made up for it. And Owen, that was a bad piece of analysis, but regardless of his analysis, he's always worked tremendously hard. So even on the last day of campaigning, Owen was in like 4 or 5 marginals, So I have nothing but admiration and respect for his work ethic. Fantastic guy. But yes, that was a terrible call. And I think it was just because of the people he was surrounded with. That we talk about the bandwagoning effect. It's a cognitive bias, and it does happen. It's because you're surrounded by people all saying the same thing. And it is literally human nature to think, well, that must be correct. I must be wrong. For me, my certainty came from the fact that Labour had lost seats at every single general election since 1997. They lost 5 million votes from 1997 to 2010. They lost 40 seats in Scotland. Worst case scenario for me was maybe Corbyn isn't the answer, but I know they're definitely not the answer. And we have to try something absolutely different, otherwise the party's dead. And we did try something different. And actually, it turns out it worked out pretty well. But I mean, Britain has massive problems, like you guys. All the indices of poverty. For instance, food stamps in these states, massively up on 10, 15 years ago, and it's plateaued. Same with us, we're in work poverty. So, as a socialist, as somebody on the radical left, you say, well, this can't carry on. Something has to happen. Something has to give. And yeah, Brexit was one manifestation of that, but I think so is Corbyn. And the idea that an electable leader would have, it's just ridiculous. People are fed up of politicians looking like bank managers. You don't have to be Einstein to know that. But,
yeah,
obviously the Guardian thinks otherwise.
Yeah, what do you think is the best mechanism by which to enforce some kind of accountability for the huge failures in the commentary with regard to Corbyn? These stretched back now almost 2 years, going back to the first leadership election. The amount of derision that he was subject to was just incredible. And it was mostly coming from people who were at least ostensibly, like we mentioned, on the liberal left. How is it now? You mentioned that the Guardian wants to have a viable business model. But at the same time, you would hope that there would be some way to enforce or to impose a penalty, whether reputationally or socially or professionally, somehow, on these people who were so consistently wrong. And they had, like the phrase, you had one job. Their one job was to proffer accurate, descriptive analysis of British politics. And if they failed in doing so, you would hope that there would be some penalty for that. But it's hard to know how to enforce such a thing.
Well, I think we can do it informally, right? So I mean, I do plenty of media stuff. Other people do plenty of media stuff. I'm going on Sky News tomorrow. It's a relatively influential channel, and I'll be with one of these people, Mr. Dan Hodges, and I will say to him, Dan, you shouldn't be on here anymore. You know, you have nothing to offer. You're incorrect about everything, and I will say that repeatedly to all these people to their face, and I would recommend that everybody does likewise. You know, because it's just not acceptable. The BBC this morning, it's a Sunday over here, and you have the politics shows on Sunday morning, I think like you guys as well. And on the Andrew Marr show, there's 3 people reviewing the papers, all anti-Corbyn voices. They all get everything wrong. And you think, what's going on here? What's going on here? Wise up. Wise up. Who, you know, I mean, they shouldn't be on here, but if the producer's so lazy, they can't even think to maybe just, it's not hard these days. Go on Twitter, message somebody. You know, how did you get in touch with me? So I think they should be fired as well. It's just, especially when you've got a public service broadcaster. Actually, the BBC, by the way, has been really remiss in this regard. I mean, we probably haven't got time to go into it, but, you know, Sky or Channel 4, Sky is actually part of Rupert Murdoch's empire, effectively. They've been far better on this than the BBC, because the BBC is a regime broadcaster. So it doesn't necessarily favour the Tories. It favours whoever's in government. And it favoured Tony Blair during the Blair years. And, you know, so... yeah, there's some big things we need to do, but I think informally, people on the left need to just keep on saying to these failures, you were wrong, you were wrong, you were wrong, go away, you know? Come back when you get something right, and if you may get some credibility back. We all get things wrong, okay? We all get things wrong. But for me, when people were saying to me on the day of the election, what's going to happen? I said, okay, there's 4 or 5 huge variables at play here. So it means there's a massive margin of error, which was reflected in the polls to a significant extent. But I said that Labour's share, I was being very conservative, you know. Labour's share of the vote will go up significantly, but it may lose seats. I never thought this would happen. So, you know, that wasn't a particularly outrageous thing to say. But even for these people, you know, that was just, bizarre, unhinged optimism. So, yeah, I would say just stigmatise them, don't let them on, make a joke of them, really, because they are a joke.
Yeah, you know, I attempted to wage a pundit accountability offensive of my own in the wake of the 2016 election, and I can tell you that it didn't have much in the way of an effect. But at the same time, though, I mean, I think there is a growing sense of discontent, at least among younger people who are more tuned into kind of relatively sophisticated media consumption, like through Twitter, through various internet-based sources and so forth, about just how the pundit class as a collective is increasingly delegitimized. So you have to kind of build up your own credibility, I think, and just lead by example, where you're showing them to be even fraudulent in some cases, and at the very least wrong. It's not a matter. I mean, everybody does get things wrong, as you mentioned. So it's not a matter of just being wrong. You know, that's an inevitability. It's a matter of holding yourself and others to account for being wrong, and then modifying your behavior in response, or adjusting your analysis in response. And that just hasn't happened in the U.S., and I'm not optimistic that it'll happen in the U.K. One other thing I wanted to mention, and then we'll wrap up, is I sort of had this thought, and I saw some other people on the American left talking about this in the wake of the election. It's just that, you know, one of the principles that I try to adhere to is to urge people against excessive veneration of politicians on a personal level. Like, don't get too hung up on their personal characteristics, on their personality, on their sort of manner or affect. Mm-hmm. And actually, on the more liberal end of the spectrum of the U.S., you see a total obsession with Trump as a persona. I mean, his vulgarisms are just dominant in how they conceptualize politics now. And true enough, Trump is a vulgar person. But it seems like there's just an inordinate fixation on Trump as a personality, and it's not really conducive to constructive politics in my view. But at the same time, you know, all that said, it's hard to not kind of like Jeremy Corbyn on a personal level. Just to, you know, his style. You know, there's a lot said about how he's an aficionado of manhole coverings and that kind of thing, and trains. He just has an appealing personality, and again, you don't want to get too caught up in that, but at the same time, it's hard to deny that it's a component of why he's gained the traction that he's gained. I mean, how do you think that dynamic is best navigated? Well,
nobody else could have done what he's done, so the personality does matter. when people have said to me, do you think he can be prime minister? Why should he be leader? I'd say leaders need three things. They need ideas, they need charisma, and they need mental toughness, resilience. And he absolutely has resilience in bucket loads. Okay. He has ideas in bucket loads. And in his own way, I think he has charisma. Now, his critics would say, well, he has no charisma. I say, well, he's got 2 out of 3 then. Okay. And actually, the mental toughness thing is very, very, very important, as we've just seen with Theresa May. Mental toughness is really important. Politics is a horrible, horrible game. And he has it in spades. And, he goes on to the leaders' debates. He nicknamed himself Monsieur Zen, during the election campaign, because he's just so relaxed. And the expectations on his shoulders, and from the other side, the hatred, the anger, the animosity is so great that, yes, I mean, you have to talk about his personality, because nobody else could have done this. So when people were saying on the left, Jeremy has to go and we'll get somebody else instead, we'll get Clive Lewis, who's a very promising young politician here, or we'll get X or Y, I would say, well, Clive Lewis has been a politician for like 2 years. Jeremy Corbyn has been in Parliament since 1983. There is no contest in terms of who you want to head this thing up. Clive Lewis could have a breakdown tomorrow. That's not a criticism of Clive Lewis. Maybe not. I mean, he could be the next, MLK. I have no idea. I'm not a fortune teller. But the point is, Jeremy Corbyn's been there and done it for more than 30 years. You have to talk about the personality, because, like I say, nobody else could have done it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we will leave it there for now. I'll be sure to tune into your Sky News appearance tomorrow, and then I'll share that with the viewership here.
It should be fun.
Yeah. And thanks for taking out some time to speak with us.
My pleasure, Michael.
All right. Take care.
Cheers. Bye.